Our next presenter is no stranger to leadership. Carly Fiorina has been at the pinnacle of corporate leadership. She started in a 9-person real estate business, eventually to become the first woman ever to lead a Fortune 50 company. That's unbelievable. She was recruited to lead Hewlett-Packard in 1999 as the industry was facing the worst technology recession in 25 years. Since then, she has gone on to become not only a presidential candidate, but also she has begun Carly Fiorina Enterprises. She has started a nonprofit organization called Unlocking Potential, and she hosts a leadership podcast called By Example. I want to ask you, if you will, join me in welcoming to the Spur Leadership stage, Carly Fiorina.
Good morning. Thank you. Thank you. You know, that was such a nice introduction from Mac. Mac and I actually just met for the first time on this stage. Can you imagine that? And here I am. Actually, I'll tell you a little secret. Governor Rick Perry, who I've known for many years, called me and said, Carly, you have to come do Mac's Spur Leadership thing. So, you know, when the governor calls, you say yes, right? So I said, okay, I'll come. So Mac and I have been texting ever since, but it's actually the first time I've met him because he was up here with the fantastic Jenna Lee. Wasn't she unbelievable? And actually, I want to start by reminding you of something that Jenna said. She said, I think leadership's about problem solving. And actually, most people don't understand that, but that's true. When Mac gave me that very gracious introduction, it was a very gracious introduction, but it sounds, I always feel like I need to set the record straight just a little bit, because it sounds like this sort of smooth trajectory, right? She started as a secretary, and then she became a CEO, and life's not like that. Life's not like that. My life hasn't been like that either. I've had setbacks and tragedies in my life, as do we all. So I want to tell you a little bit about the real story, but just a little bit. Because what I actually want to talk to you about is some of the people who've shown me what true leadership is. I think we get very confused about leadership. In fact, I think we're so confused about leadership that I have a new book coming out on Monday. It's called Find Your Way. If you want to order it, you can text Carly, C-A-R-L-Y, to 345-345. It's that simple. And we'll get in touch with you. But the reason I have this book coming out, the reason I was happy to come today, is because I think we're at a place in our culture and in our country where we're really mixed up about leadership. We think about for a moment what our culture lifts up. What does our culture lift up? Conflict, controversy, outrage, craziness, power, fame, wealth, position, title. We lift up the winners. We push down the losers. You're number one or you're nothing. All those messages are exactly the opposite of what real leadership is about. Yes, a leader can have a title, but the title doesn't make them a leader. Yes, a leader might have achieved some degree of fame or wealth, but that's not why they're a leader. One of the things that I learned in running for political office is that so often we look to others to solve our problems, maybe Washington, and we're so often disappointed because the problems don't ever seem to get solved. I was talking with the guy that drove me over here from the hotel this morning, and I said, well, what do you think about the immigration thing? I'm not going to get into politics here, but the point is, we agreed, wow, we've been talking about immigration for how long? 30 years? 30 years. Same arguments back and forth, and yet somehow nothing changes. So we get disappointed because we thought, oh, those are people in Washington, they have big titles, they must be leaders, and then we're surprised when problems don't get solved. We get disappointed, or we get terribly disappointed when people in positions of leadership break our trust incredibly. They end up doing things that are exactly the opposite of leadership. And so I wrote the book in a way because I think we need a bit of a refresher course. And I also think that we so often look to others to do something for us when the answer, the power, lies within each of us and the people around us. And that's actually the most important thing that I learned way back when I was a secretary. When I was a secretary, by the way, why did I start as a secretary? Because I graduated from college with a degree in, wait for it, medieval history and philosophy. Yeah. I've never regretted that education, but it wasn't exactly great on the resume. And this was kind of a long time ago, and there weren't a lot of jobs for women, and it was the middle of a recession, and okay. And so I went to law school because that's what my dad and my mom thought I should do. My dad loved the law, so he thought I should. And because perhaps I was a middle child, my core competence at that time in my life was pleasing my parents. I was the peacekeeper. I was the kid who wasn't ever going to let him down. So Dad wanted me to go to law school. I went to law school. I discovered I hated law school, hated it. And somehow I figured out that pleasing my parents wasn't a worthy life goal. And so I quit. My father said to me, "I'm afraid you're never going to amount to anything." My mother said, "I'm so disappointed. What are you going to do?" As parents, we know how hard those words cut, right? I didn't know what to do. I had zero plan. But what I knew is I had to make a living. And one of the things that I did when I was in college is I worked as a Kelly girl. We don't call them Kelly girls anymore. It's not politically correct. But Kelly girls back then, now we talk about Kelly temporary personnel. Kelly girls were mostly women. And we went into offices on a temporary basis, and we did office work. And I knew how to type. That was back in the days when you had to type. My granddaughters have no idea what I'm talking about. When I say, I typed, what do you mean you typed? You keyboarded. No, I typed on an IBM Selectric. But I knew how to do that. And I knew how to answer the phones because I'd worked at a hair salon answering the phones, and I knew how to file paperwork. So I took the first job I was offered, which was to work as a receptionist in a 9-person real estate firm. I had no plan. I just wanted to do a good job. Because the one thing that I remember my parents always saying to me was, whatever you do, do it with excellence and work hard. Sometimes young people, in fact, I was talking at a university yesterday, and young people will say, what's the one piece of advice you would give me as I'm getting out of school? And my advice is always the same. Get a job. Get a job. Any job. Any job. It doesn't matter what job. Don't worry about the perfect job. Don't worry about whether the job stacks up to your friends' jobs. Just get a job. And when you get that job, do a good job. And when you do a good job, people are going to pay attention. Opportunity will knock. And when it knocks, you be brave enough to walk through the door. Never, never feel you are too good for that job. Buckle down and do it well. And good things are going to happen. That's all I did. That's all I did. I did a good job. But then here's what someone did for me. And I have never forgotten this. Back then, I thought the leader was the guy with the big office, the big title, the big parking space, the perks. One day, 6 months into that job, 2 men came to my desk and stood in front of me and said, we've been watching you. We think you can do more than type and file. Do you want to know what we do? Wow, yes, I kind of do want to know what you do. Those two men introduced me to business. They helped me discover I liked the teamwork of it. I liked the results of it. You know, philosophy is a little abstract. This was right down on the ground. By the way, I read philosophy in Greek and Latin. I mean, that's how geeky I was. So it was right on the ground, and I liked the fact that you could serve customers. So it was a very important thing that those two men said, we're going to show you the ropes. We're going to introduce you to a whole way of life I'd never even thought about. I never thought about being a business person. But here's the most important thing they did. They showed me a lesson in true leadership, although it took me many years to understand it. Those two men saw possibilities in me. And because they saw possibilities in me, I saw possibilities in myself that I didn't know I had. The purpose of a leader is to solve problems. A leader changes the order of things for the better. But the highest calling of a leader is to unlock potential in others. They unlocked possibilities in me. Eventually, I would get an MBA. Eventually, I would land at AT&T when it was 1 million employees. And I was literally 1 out of 1 million at the very, very bottom of the totem pole. It was a tough go at first because there were not women at AT&T. And so my first customer meeting was held in a strip club because that's where they went. So there were tough things along the way. But here's what I found out. First of all, I noticed that there were problems everywhere. Everywhere I looked, there were problems. And everyone talked about the problems. Have you noticed that in any organization, any community, any situation, people always talk about the problems? They talk about them at the water cooler. They bitch about them on the coffee break, whatever. They're always talking about them, and yet nothing really happens. They just talk. Washington talks, but we all talk about the problems. And I wonder, why is it all these problems keep getting talked about and nobody does anything about it? And because, honestly, nobody had any hopes for me, I started to listen to the people talking about them, and I learned people closest to the problem actually know best how to solve it. People closest to the problem know best how to solve it, but they so rarely are asked. Or they think it's not their job. Or they're told to stay in their lane. That's not your job, don't worry about that, do this, right? We get told that a lot in big organizations. And yet, the people impacted by these problems knew something about how to make them better. So you know what I did? I collaborated with the people around me and we solved problems. We solved problems. And what I found out is that over time, I liked solving problems. It was challenging, it was fun. The teamwork of it was fun. And so I would run to problems, not away from them. I would always take the job that everybody said, oh, don't go there, oh my goodness, it's so screwed up. It was like, wow, I know there are gonna be people there who know how to make this better. Now I'm gonna tell you a different story. Not about me. It's about one of the purest examples of leadership I've ever seen. And it happened a long way away from here. In fact, it happened in New Delhi, India. Before I ran for president, I had the privilege of serving as chairwoman of an organization called Opportunity International. It is a Christian-based organization that specializes in micro-lending. Micro-lending, if you have heard that term, is the process of lending very small amounts of money to very, very poor people who live on the absolute bottom of the pyramid. And along with that very small loan, they are given entrepreneurial training so that they have an opportunity to begin to lift themselves and their families out of truly abject and desperate poverty. I've seen all kinds of people in all kinds of situations all over the world. I've lived and worked all over the world, and I can tell you with absolute certainty, that just because people are poor doesn't mean they lack ambition or that they lack potential. It's sometimes that their circumstances are just hard for them to get out of. In any event, I was holding a board meeting in New Delhi, India. And at the end of that board meeting, I said I'd like to meet with some of our clients. And so we traveled to the slums because that's where our clients were. They were in the slums. Now, I don't know how many of you have been to the slums of New Delhi, but these are some of the most desperate circumstances I have ever seen. Piles of sewage, trash, marauding animals, people piled on top of each other. It is among the most desperate set of circumstances I have ever seen. And I was going to meet with some of our clients and had to climb this rickety little ladder to get to the rooftop of a building where we were going to meet. And I must tell you honestly, as I climbed that rickety little ladder, I was steeling myself. I was steeling myself because these were desperate circumstances. And I imagined that the women, our clients were women in that village, were going to be desperate because desperation was all around them. But when I got to the top of that ladder and I sat down with them and looked them in the eye, I did not see desperation. I saw pride. I saw focus. I saw determination. They were laughing. They were hopeful. It sort of hit me as I watched these women. You know, we did a lot more than give them a loan. We did a lot more than tell them that we could help them become entrepreneurs. We had done a lot more than that. What we had said to them with that money and with that training is, you have possibilities. You have possibilities. You actually can change the order of your things for the better. And that makes all the difference in the world. In any event, this one woman was telling me that when she was first offered the loan, when she was first offered this training, she said no. And the reason she said no is because in her culture, you didn't do this. Her husband said no. Her parents said no. Her in-laws said no. You don't do this. As desperate as her circumstances were, as terrible as the problems were all around her that she and her family were suffering from, the expectations of her culture, the way things had always been was even more powerful. And so she said no. And yet here she was, a year and a half later. And so I said, well, what does your family think now? She said, oh, they're very happy they all work for me. Now let's imagine for a moment, let's just step back. What makes that woman a leader? Why does she represent the essence of leadership? She has no position, no title, no fame, no wealth. You will never hear of her. And yet, she is a leader. Now, while you think about that, I'm going to tell you two other stories, or maybe one for now. One is about a man named Jim. Jim used to work for me a long time ago in AT&T. Jim was an engineer. Jim was one of these people who was dependable, reliable, not very noticeable. You know, he came in the same time every day. He left the same time every day, ate lunch at his desk every day, head down, did his job. He was a good manager, solid, dependable, reliable Jim. And one day I went to Jim and I asked questions. By the way, one of the great gifts that I received, because I was a medieval history major and a law school dropout and I didn't know anything about technology and communications when I started out, is I knew I didn't know anything, and so I asked a ton of questions. I asked questions of people all day long, and I learned a lot. So one of the questions I asked Jim, because I'd learned there are a lot of problems hanging around and nobody's ever doing anything about them, and I like problems because I think they're fun to team with other people and solve. I said to Jim, do you see any problems? And he sort of thought about it for a minute. He said, yeah, I do. Now, Jim designed circuits. That was his job. He said, every month I send a bunch of circuit designs over to our suppliers, and we get bills back. And the bills don't match my designs. Now, by the way, the bills weren't Jim's job. They were finance's job. And there's a lot of messages that we get in big organizations, which, hey, that's not your job. Don't worry about that. You know, stay in your lane, stick to your job. Anyway, Jim said, the bills don't match the circuits. I said, well, what do you think we ought to do about that, Jim? People closest to the problem always know something can be done. And he said, I think we ought to check them. I said, okay. So Jim and I sat around for a couple weeks looking at paper. It was paper back then, out of boxes. It wasn't sexy work. It wasn't glamorous work, but we kept looking at designs and bills and designs and bills. And he was right. They didn't match. So now I go secure some other resources, and we start checking all the bills. Jim, that unremarkable, dependable, no flash, no dazzle to Jim saved the company $300 million in a single year. You go, Jim. Okay, so let's talk for a moment about what those two stories have in common. Because both those stories are about problem solving and both those stories are about leadership. In my new book, Find Your Way, and in all of the teaching I've ever done or developing of teams or lifting up leaders wherever they are, the first thing I say to people about leadership is, you must have courage. Why would that be the first thing? Courage. Well, by the way, it's the same reason that when you read the Bible, God talks to us about courage all the time. Courage is probably in the Bible almost more than anything else. Courage, courage, courage. Why courage? Because the way things are is very powerful, right? The way things are. It doesn't mean they're good. It doesn't mean everybody's happy with them. It doesn't mean that people don't sit around talking about how good it would be for it to change. But the truth is, the way things are is very powerful. And the reason it's powerful is because people are invested in it. Imagine it taking courage to try and lift your family out of poverty. And yet it took enormous courage because the way things are was, you don't do this. This is the way our culture works. This is the way our culture has always worked. You don't do this. That status quo, that the way things are, had enormous power. So much power that most people said, okay. In Jim's case, the status quo was, that ain't your job. That ain't your job. So the first thing a leader needs to understand, the first thing, you heard this from Jenna as well, but it's worth reminding ourselves of. The first thing, if you're going to solve problems, if you're actually going to change the order of things for the better, the first thing you better get ready for is what? What happened to that woman? She got criticized. She got criticized. No. Okay, we know it's bad, but you don't get to do that. Okay, we know it's bad, but that's not your job. What are you trying to do? Make finance look bad? How many times are you criticized because you actually want to make a change? Right? So I'll say to people, look, criticism is the price of leadership. If problem solving is the purpose of leadership, and unlocking potential in others is the highest calling of leadership, criticism is the price. So just know that. And you have to be brave enough to get through that. And by the way, that's really hard today, right? Think about the level of criticism, the level of vitriol, the omnipresence of all these people telling you, what are you doing? You're wrong. It's not just the villager next door. It's social media. It's courage. Courage is required to withstand the price of criticism. Why is changing things so hard? The power of the status quo. People are invested in the status quo. Someone has done well in the status quo. Whatever it is, someone's on top. They want to stay on top, right? This is human nature. But here's the other reason the status quo has power. Here's the other reason why changing the order of things for the better is actually so very hard and requires real leadership and real courage. It's because I like to say, change is like heaven. Everyone wants to go there, but nobody wants to die. And change is a lot like that. Everyone talks about it. But when you get right down to doing it, it's hard. It's hard because of the criticism you're going to face, but it's also hard because you have to do something different. You have to change maybe what you do. Wow, this woman's in-laws had to get used to the fact that they worked for her. Jim had to get used to the fact that he was no longer a quiet engineer who got to go home at the same time every day. All of a sudden, he was supervising 60 temporary people who were checking bills. He was all of a sudden the big boss. And people in finance were kind of ticked off at him because he was making them look bad. Jenna was telling you about the great white sharks. It was such a great analogy. I'll give you another one. I don't know how many of you know anything about Spanish bullfighting. I'm not particularly a fan, but I've spent some time working in Spain, and so I got to know something about it. And in bullfighting, there is a term called querencia. Querencia refers to a spot in the ring that every bull has. Now, if you know anything about bullfighting, you know it's not really a fair fight. There's one bull who looks ferocious and mean, and then there's a matador, but there are a bunch of picadors and toreros and all these people who are going to stab the bull to death. But the bull's strength, his rage, his unpredictability is what makes him dangerous. As a bullfight goes on, a bull will go to his querencia. It is a spot in the ring where he retreats in between charges. And what the matador and the picadors will do is figure out over time, where is his querencia? So what do you suppose happens when the bull, instead of being unpredictable, keeps returning to the same place? He feels safe there, but in fact, he is vulnerable there, because he is predictable. People have querencias too. We all have our querencia. We all have the place where we go when we feel uncertain, threatened, criticized. And frequently it's the worst place to go. You know what the querencia is of a lot of big organizations? Reorganize, right? How many times do big organizations say, we got a real problem, we need to reorganize? You know why organizations are always reorganizing, whether it solves a problem or not, is because they know how to do that. We know how to change the lines and the boxes on the organization chart. We know how to say you got a new boss. We know how to do that. It's a little bit harder sometimes to say, actually, it's not going to solve the problem. Courage is required to change the order of things for the better. And sometimes that courage applies to facing criticism from others, but sometimes, so often, that courage applies to what we ourselves have to do. Remember that strip club story I told you? Oh my gosh, I was afraid. I was afraid to go into a strip club. I'd never been in such a circumstance before. And I thought I was a serious professional businesswoman. I went in with my little bow tie. Anybody remember How to Dress for Success? Remember that book? Anyway, we wore our bow ties. So, courage, first and most important quality of a leader. The courage to challenge the way things are. The courage to withstand criticism. The courage, maybe, to change the way we are. One of the things I've learned is that everyone is afraid of something. Everyone. We do a lot of work with wounded warriors. And you would think that in my nonprofit, and you would think that, you would think that a wounded warrior, my goodness, I mean, these are people who have been unbelievably brave through so much. And yet, I've met so many of them who are afraid to go to a job interview. They're afraid because they feel unprepared. They're afraid because they think someone will pity them. They're afraid because they think maybe no one's going to offer me a job. They're afraid because what if I get the job and I fail? We're all afraid of something. And so we're all afraid of something. There are existential fears. I had a very tough battle with cancer. So for a long time, I was afraid I was going to die. Those are existential fears. We lost our younger daughter to the demons of addiction. And so there's a profound fear. Oh my God, I'm going to lose my child to this terrible disease. Those are existential fears, and those can be, of course, debilitating. But what's interesting about human nature, it's the things that aren't existential that can be equally debilitating. I'm afraid I'm going to be pitied. I'm afraid I'm going to look foolish. I'm afraid I'm going to make a mistake. I'm afraid I won't be perfect. I'm afraid someone won't like me. I'm afraid my Instagram photos aren't perfect. Those are such superficial, silly fears, and yet they paralyze people. So many times I've had teams, they know what to do. And yet when you really push at it, it's like, but what if we make a mistake? What if we look foolish? Those are not existential fears. Those are not profound fears, but those can be debilitating fears. And we all have to get over them. And one of the things that I've learned is it's useless to say, I'm not afraid. We're all afraid of something. What's useful is to sit down, I talk about this in my book, is to sit down. I've done this many times because I've been afraid of many things. When you're first, when you're different, it's scary. I've been afraid of many things. And the way I get over my fear is to write it down, say what it is. What am I afraid of? What am I afraid of? Let's say it. Let's speak it. I'm afraid of looking like an idiot in a strip club. I'm afraid of failing. I'm afraid of everybody focusing on the wrong thing, whatever it is. And then I go through an exercise. What's the best that can happen? What's the worst that can happen? And it turns out that frequently the worst thing you can imagine happening isn't really all that bad. And the best thing that you thought would happen turns out to be so much better than you thought. I'll give you an example. For the longest time, I didn't want to talk about our daughter. I was sorrowful. I was devastated. But the truth is, I was also embarrassed in a way. What would people think? What would people think of me? Well, couldn't you do something? Couldn't you save her? I mean, what kind of parents are you? And so for the longest time, I couldn't talk about it. But I also believe that leaders have to be authentic. They have to be true. And I thought, I can't not speak about what was one of the most impactful experiences in my life. And so little by little, I started to talk about it. I went through that exercise. What am I afraid of? And I wrote down. People will think I'm a bad mother. People will think I'm a bad person. I wrote it down. I looked at it. I thought about it. And then I thought, well, what's the best that can happen? And I thought, well, maybe someone else is struggling with the same thing. Maybe I can help someone else. But when I actually spoke about it for the first time, there was a blessing. A woman came up to me afterwards and she said, thank you so much for telling me that. I'm going through the same thing with my son, and you have lifted me up. That was a gift. And what I've learned over and over again, and you know this, the toughest passages in life always come with blessings if we will see them. And what I also have learned is when we are brave, there is a gift that comes along with that. It's what the Bible tells us, but it's what life teaches us as well. So we have to have courage. What's the other thing that leaders all have, and we don't lift this up in our culture today? You know the word, but we don't say it much. It's called character. 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 What is character? Character, we know it when we see it, but we don't celebrate it much. In fact, we celebrate just the opposite. Who's outrageous? Who's controversial? Who's, I don't know, stupid and dumb? It seems to me that we lift up a lot of stupid and dumb people in our culture, honestly. But character is what? It's integrity over time. It's consistency over time. It's honor over time, right? And why is character so important? Because if you're going to change the order of things for the better, which is the purpose of leadership, if you're going to solve the problems right in front of you, the ones that you know best, the ones that the people around you know best, if you're going to do that, the going always gets tough. It never works out the way you think it's going to work out. You can have the best laid plans, and something happens. Something happens. A technology recession happens right when you become a CEO. Your teammate gets the flu. Whatever it is, something happens. The going gets tough. And so character is required, because character is what keeps you going when the going gets tough. And if you think, as a leader, that, hey, I got it all mapped out, it's all going to go the way, no, it never does. Never does. Character. One of the things that Jesus shows us as an example, think about it, is the most influential leader in all of human history. Whether you're a Christian or not, he's the most influential leader in history. He had no position, no title, no fame, no wealth. He was criticized, castigated. He certainly needed courage and character. But the lesson that we learn from Jesus over and over again are two essential qualities of leadership: humility and empathy. Humility. Jesus was humble above everything else. And why is humility so important in a leader? Because if you are a person who thinks you know it all and can do it all, then you won't get it done. I alone actually can never fix it. In truth, nothing worth happening ever happens with someone acting alone. Nothing. Nothing worth happening happens with somebody acting alone. And for sure, problems don't get solved with somebody acting alone. So someone has to be humble enough to say, I don't know it all. I can't do it all. I need other people to help me, to make me smarter. I learned humility, thankfully, it was such a gift. I learned humility because I didn't know anything. I didn't know anything when I started working. So I had to ask everybody. It turns out people respond well when you ask them. They like to talk about what they're doing. But I also learned, wow, do I learn a lot? Do I gain a lot when instead of showing up and telling everybody what I know, I ask a question? Humility. But the flip side is empathy. By the way, I should say humility is not false modesty. Humility is not hiding your light under a bushel. Humility is not saying, oh, no, you don't mean me. I can't possibly do that. That's not what humility is. Humility is just, I don't know it all. I can't do it all. And I need other people. I need help. Empathy is the ability to see and hear someone for who they really are. To actually be willing to hear their story. And most especially to see the value they bring. Empathy, we are lacking empathy in our society today. We are lacking empathy in our media. We are lacking empathy in our politics. We are so quick to condemn people because we don't agree with them, because we don't like the way they look, because we judge them by their circumstances. I mean, we judge so quickly, and we tend to destroy character. We castigate people. Well, I don't agree with you, therefore you're terrible. My candidacy was called by some offensive to women because I'm pro-life. That's a castigation of character based on the fact that gee, well, we don't agree with that. But guess what? It happens everywhere. Empathy is the ability to see and hear someone else for who they really are, to appreciate their journey, their story, and to say, you know what, I may not agree with you on everything, but in this problem, we can work together. In this problem, we can find common ground. You know, it's interesting, we celebrate winners, we crush losers. Politics is about win-lose. And sports is about win-lose. And so much of social media is about win-lose. The dynamics, our legal system is about frequently win-lose. And that's a certain dynamic. The dynamic of problem solving, and therefore the dynamic of leadership, is always about win-win. Always. If you actually want to solve a problem, there's got to be a win-win in it. That doesn't mean compromising principles. It means that people have to find a way to collaborate and change the order of things for the better that actually makes things better for everybody. So it's a win-win. And so if you're not humble and you're not empathetic, then you can't collaborate effectively with people, particularly people who may be different than you in some way. And if you can't collaborate, you can't solve a problem. There are very few people that we agree with 100% of the time. And so why do we divide ourselves up into tribes so quickly based on beliefs? And we do. We divide ourselves up into tribes. I don't agree with anybody 100% of the time. I don't agree with myself 100% of the time. I don't agree with the people I'm closest to and love most in the whole world 100% of the time. So how can we possibly expect that we're going to work with a group of people or live in a community where we all agree all the time? We're not. We're not. But that doesn't mean that we can't collaborate with one another in a community to change the order of things for the better. Courage, character, the humility and empathy necessary to collaborate with others, especially those different than themselves. And one last thing. One last thing. A leader sees possibilities. A leader sees possibilities. I talked about Jesus. Who were Jesus' disciples? Strays and losers, honestly. When Jesus picked his disciples, they were not the leaders of society. They were strays and losers. He saw possibilities, and that is what leaders do. Leaders see possibilities in circumstances to change them, to make them better, but they also, most importantly, see possibilities in other people. There are two kinds of people that I've run across in my life. There are people who walk into a situation and they see all the limitations, all the constraints, all the guardrails, all the lanes they're supposed to be in. And these are people who say, okay, I can do this, but I can't do this. Well, they'll let me do this, but I'm not going to do that. Well, we tried this, so I'm not going to try it again. I would call those people in a business situation, I would call those people managers. They're not bad people. They sometimes produce excellent results. But managers are people who operate within existing constraints and conditions. Leaders, the other kind of people, are the kind of people who walk into exactly the same set of circumstances, look at exactly the same set of people, and instead of seeing all the limitations, they see all the possibilities. Wow, I bet you that person could help me. Wow, we never tried this. You know, how about we do this? Leaders see possibilities in the circumstances around them, but most especially in the people around them. People ask me sometimes, what gets me going? What keeps me going? I will tell you. There is a look. I'm sure I had that look many years ago when those two men said, we see possibilities in you. There is a look that people get in their eyes when they realize they can do something they didn't think they could do. when they achieve something they didn't think they could achieve, when they solve a festering problem that has been a thorn in their side for so long and they didn't think they could do it, there is a look that people get. It is the same look the world over. It is the same look in every pair of eyes I've ever seen it in. We see that look in our kids' eyes. I saw that look in that woman's eyes. That look, for me, is fuel. And we don't see that look enough. And yet, everywhere we look, there are problems. Everywhere we look, there are people who understand how to make those problems better. And everywhere we look, we need more leaders to stand up and be lifted up. And that is why I wrote the book. I will close on this final note. George Washington, in 1789, after he was done, going across that river that Jenna mentioned. In 1789, in his farewell address to the nation, George Washington said to the nation, "Beware the rise of political parties." Our founders did not want them, interestingly. Beware the rise of political parties because they will come to care only about winning. Kind of smart. Maybe 50 or so years later, maybe a little less, a man named Alex de Tocqueville traveled throughout America. He was a Frenchman. And he was inspired by the American democratic experiment that he saw. But it was not the institutions of government that impressed him. It was what he called civil society. And what he said was, the strength of a democracy is measured in the willingness of private citizens to change things for the better. I think there's a lot to that. We have a lot of problems, but we have a lot of leaders. We have a lot of conflict, but we have a lot of people sitting in communities just like you, all across this nation, who actually understand how to make the problems right in front of them better. All it takes is courage, the courage to stand up and say, I don't care what people say, we can make it better. All it takes is the character to keep going when it gets tough, and it does get tough. It takes the humility to say, I can reach out to people even if I don't agree with them, because I need them. And the empathy to say, okay, we don't agree 50% of the time, but on the rest of this stuff, we can work together. And it takes people who have the capacity to see possibilities all around them. In the end, as you all know, faith is a choice. Leadership is a choice as well. It is a choice we can all make. Everyone is capable of leadership. Everyone has more potential than they realize. Everyone. It is a choice to be courageous. It is a choice to have character. It is a choice to be humble and empathetic and collaborate with others. And it is most definitely a choice to see the possibilities all around us. And so, for your community, for your church, for your state, for our nation, choose to lead. Thank you so very much.
Wow. Again, I'm like, she's a pretty good communicator. That was incredible. Thank you, Carly, so much. Man, there's so much I want to ask you. But I couldn't help but think about this. When you talked about becoming the CEO of HP right as the tech industry was hitting this massive recession. You're the first woman to run a Fortune 50 company. Here's my question for you. At that moment, there's no playbook.
No.
what do you do?
Well, you know, it's so interesting. Not only was I the first woman, I was the first outsider to ever lead Hewlett-Packard. I was the first non-engineer.
Which that's a big deal at HP, right? I mean,
It's a big
to be
deal
an
at
outsider, because
HP.
they had done that.
They'd never had one. They'd never had one.
Right.
Okay.
And they had a really strong
They
culture.
had a really strong culture. First non-engineer, first person not from the industry. I was from communications. I wasn't from Silicon Valley. Ooh, a lot of firsts. I'll share a funny story with you to illustrate my answer in a moment. When I was running for president, I would get a lot of questions from journalists who would say, well, what's it like being a woman candidate? Or, what's it like being the only woman on the stage? And my answer, honestly, was, I don't know. I've never been a man. I mean, I don't know. This is all I know. Now, I start with that. And by the way, sometimes I would add, I think the men are actually more uncomfortable with it than I am, because I've been doing this a long time. But I start with that because when I came to Hewlett-Packard, what I was focused on was I was hired to transform a company. We were in deep trouble. We had missed 9 quarters in a row. So I arrived, talk about bad timing. I arrived at the peak of the dot-com boom. Man, everything's going great. And 6 months later, it's all gone to you-know-where.
Not great.
So bad timing, really bad timing. In any event, but I was hired to transform a company because during this technology boom that had gone on for 6 or 7 years, we had missed 9 quarters in a row. That's hard to do for a big company because you can engineer the numbers all kinds of ways, some of them not honest. We were losing market share. Our profitability was deteriorating. Our culture had become stultified. We were no longer innovating, even though we spent massive amounts of money on innovation. So I was focused on, okay, what are we going to do to restore this great company to greatness and to innovate once again? On day one, all anybody wanted to talk about was the fact that I was a woman. I was totally unprepared for these questions. Well, I mean, you're a woman, you've broken the glass ceiling, what are you going to do? You're a woman, and all I wanted to talk about was, look, this is this incredible company, and we have these unbelievable assets, and we're going to go be doing all these great things. That's what I wanted to talk about. And they wanted to talk about what I looked like, my gender, my circumstances, my appearance. It's an example, sadly. Now, I understand it's a milestone moment, and I didn't respond necessarily in the best way that I could have. But to me, it was a reminder that we get so focused on the outside, not the inside. We get so focused on the superficial, not the substance. I'm very proud to be a woman. And I think that as a nation, when we don't tap every ounce of talent that we have, no matter what it looks like, we're being foolish. And we're hurting ourselves. And we haven't made enough progress in women in the workforce or people of color. We haven't. The data says it. On the other hand, the way you make progress is to focus on what's on the inside and focus people on substance and solving problems. So I found it very frustrating. I had a plan. We had a plan. We went on and did the plan. But, wow, you're a woman. Wasn't what I was expecting.
Let me ask you a question, because I'm curious about this. When you say you didn't respond as well as you could have, how did you respond? What does that mean?
Well, so the first thing I tried to do was change the subject, and I've learned over and over, journalists don't like it when you change the subject. I mean, when they have a subject they want to talk about, they don't really like it when you don't talk about that.
Generally notwithstanding.
So, yeah, okay, I should, by the way,
teasing.
to the point, journalists, people who interview you
Right,
from the media,
right.
okay? Maybe not, a lot of them aren't journalists, but they have a point of view, and they want to ask a particular question. And when you try and deflect,
Did you find
let me talk about the
did you find by
substance
the
of
time
this
they called
company.
you? I'm sorry to interrupt. Did you find by the time they called you, they had already written the story?
Sometimes, yeah.
Yeah.
Or there was the famous editor from Business Week. It's since gone out of business. I must say I took a tiny bit of delight in that, I have to be honest, but editor of Business Week, they're doing this big cover story. Okay, I'm the new CEO. We have all this going on, and we walk in. First question. What designer is your suit?
Wow.
Really? So the way I answered, there was all this discussion about a glass ceiling, and my answer was there is not a glass ceiling. A woman can achieve the highest office possible. Now, a lot of women...
Absolutely.
Well, a lot of women heard that in a way I didn't intend it. They heard it to mean I am dismissing their struggles. It's not what I meant. They heard it to mean I've never experienced any of those struggles. I have, virtually all of them. Remember, my first meeting was in a strip club. That's not what I meant by there is no glass ceiling. What I meant was, look at the possibilities.
Right.
Don't be discouraged by this invisible thing everybody keeps telling you is there when it may not be there.
Right, right. I loved what you said. I thought it was fascinating when you said that reorganization is the safe spot of a lot of corporations because they know how to do that.
They know how to do that.
And it's relative to actually changing a culture and the behavior of a business. It's easier to change the lines on the org chart and retitle people and retitle divisions and that sort of thing. Talk a little bit.
And it frequently pops the stock temporarily.
Yeah.
The stock market reacts well to reorganize. Oh, they're doing something. They're reorganizing. Let's bump the stock price.
Right, right. But when it's all said and done, it's going to be what is sustained over time.
That's right.
Versus what gets drawn on a piece of paper and presented at a press conference or whatever. I would love it because I think all of us in this room, if you've led anything for any amount of time, you've gotten to the point where you think, oh no, what do I do? Where do we go? Maybe I'm the only one. Y'all are looking at me like I'm crazy. But I think we've all been there.
Of course.
So when you get there, what is the option to reorganizing?
So it is easy to become. I talk about this in my book. I've developed over the years a very powerful but simple tool that I have used when I have gotten overwhelmed. And I've led enormous organizations. By the time I left, Hewlett-Packard was $90 billion and 140,000 employees in 189 countries, okay? So I understand complexity. And when you're dealing with that level of complexity, by the way, when you're dealing with a much lower level of complexity, it's easy to feel overwhelmed. And so I had to develop a tool for myself to keep myself on track so I didn't run to the Carencia of reorganization. So again, if you text Carly, C-A-R-L-Y, to 345-345, you can get the book. But the tool is this. It's a square. 4 things you need to worry about all the time. Top of the square. It's called the leadership framework. Top. Goals. What are your goals? So frequently, people forget their goals. Mm-hmm. They get overwhelmed, they get lost, the going gets tough, and they forget, what am I here to do, actually? What did I set out to do?
Right.
So in our case, Hewlett-Packard, we are here to be the technology leader and innovate and grow. That's our goal. Can't run away from that. And when the going gets tough, people always want to say, well, you didn't really mean that, right? You didn't really mean that goal, right? You didn't really mean to create a great Spur Leadership Conference year after year. That's not what you meant. Goals. Another side of the frame. Structure and process. It's like who does what. It's actually important to think that through. Yeah. Because sometimes who's doing what is not aligned with your goals. We wanted to be better at customer service. You can't do that when you have 87 separate business units all with their own president. Okay, so we have to organize things different. But now come the most important things, the most sustainable things. Metrics. What do you measure? What do you measure? And the reason that's so, you can measure anything. We can measure how many steps we take. We can measure how many calories we eat. We can measure anything. But the reason measurement is so important is because in any organization, I don't care if it's 15 people like my current office is, the nonprofit is much bigger, or it's 50,000. What you measure is what gets done. And the reason it gets done is because people figure out you value it. So if you have a company that only measures profit, nothing else matters. That's how companies get into trouble. We were a company that said we innovated, and yet we never measured anything that had anything to do with innovation. We were a company that said we valued customer service, but we never measured it, and we didn't pay people on it. So we started measuring the things we value. And we went from not knowing how many patents a day we did, or how many we even had in total, to 3 a day, to 7 a day, to 9 a day, to 15 a day. People pay attention to what you measure. And the final piece is culture. And what's culture? Culture is how people behave, how people treat each other. What's it like to work around here? What's it like to work around here? What's it like to worship around here? What's it like to be around here? And the thing is, people will refer to culture as the soft stuff. Culture is the hardest stuff of all. I refer to culture as the software. It's the software of a business. It's the software of a team. It's the software of a family. It's the software of a church. And if the software doesn't work with the goals and the rest of it, it doesn't work. And you can approach changing culture with the same rigor and analysis that you approach everything else. Start by asking people. We did this. We asked people, what's it like to work around here? And they'll tell you. And then you ask them, what do you want it to be like? And they'll tell you that too. And once they tell you that, and most people aspire to the same things, you know, we want integrity, we want respect, we want to serve, we want to take risks. But once they say that, then you have to do it. And you'll see a lot of organizations that have a code of conduct on the wall, and it'll say things, but it's not what they do. People watch the walk. They don't pay any attention to the talk. So if you want to inculcate a culture, promote the people who live the culture.
Yeah.
And don't promote the people that don't. And that's sometimes a really hard thing, because sometimes the people who don't live the culture produce results.
Yeah.
Right? Oh, yeah, but, I mean, he delivers every quarter. But
Carly,
he's not
do you know
a
how many times
collaborator.
we've dealt with that in the church?
Of course you do.
We're like, yeah, I mean, this was years ago, and I know we have some pastors who are here today, but I can't tell you how many times I've said, look, I know he's hard to work with, but he's so good at what he does. Or a lot of times in church world too, we'll say, you know, he's a nice guy, but and I'm like, no, a nice guy wouldn't have talked to them like that. You know what I mean? So I think when you talk about the culture being the kind of the bedrock of the four squares, did you all figure out a way to measure the culture?
Yeah, we did. And by the way, I know, because I've done a lot of work with pastors around the country, I know sometimes in churches this issue of, is someone living the culture, gets really mixed up with, you know, are we being Christian? Are we, first of all, if you're going to have to deal with someone as a performance issue because they're not living the culture, they're not behaving in the way that you need them to behave, or they're not producing in the way you need them to produce, the first thing you have to do is tell them that truthfully. You have to have an honest conversation with them and give them a chance to get better.
Right? Absolutely.
I mean, people jump over that step
That's actually
all the time.
That's actually an act of kindness
Yes.
to them.
The most respectful, the kindest thing you can do for someone is tell them the truth in a caring way. This is the truth. I want to help you to be better, but this is the truth. But if someone can't get there, then you have to put them somewhere else. Because what happens is people will observe. I'll tell you a small story. When I was a young manager, I had a bunch of people who worked for me, and we had this guy who was a lot higher level than I was, and he would show up and ask my team to do work. He was a big fancy lawyer in this corporation, and we had information that he needed. And we had a code of conduct on the walls that said respect for the individual. And he would come in and he would disrespect everyone all the time. Okay? That went on for a long time. And what do you suppose was happening? Everybody was watching. Do we really respect the individual or do we not? And so I knew I had a choice. I had a choice. So I called him up. He's 3 levels above. I said, Glenn, you can't treat people this way. You're disrespectful. You're demeaning. You're working them hard. They're doing the best they can for you. You can't treat people this way. He goes off the handle, flies off the handle, swears, gets through it all, and then says, and what are you going to do about it? Okay, moment of truth for me. Moment of truth for me. Of course he would say that. I mean, I was this young woman who was 3 levels beneath him. How dare I question him? And so I said, until you behave differently, we won't do any more work for you. And I hung up the phone. And I burst into tears. And I called my husband and said, I'm going to be fired. Then I went out to my team and I said, here's what happened. I may be fired, but we're not going to work for this gentleman anymore because respect for the individual means something around here. And he will respect you or we will not do his work. And 3 days later, he came back and apologized. The point is, if a culture's going to be real, you have to confront when people don't behave according to the culture. If a culture's going to be real, you have to be honest with people when they're not living the culture. If a culture's going to be real, you got to walk the walk because nobody listens to the talk. They know it's just talk.
That's the story that nobody knows. That's the thing, because it's one thing, but that's the courage that you talked about throughout the entire thing today. And I think that's the point that genuine leadership owns. Genuine leadership says, I may get fired, which is scary.
Well, yes, totally.
I mean, because how far back was that experience?
85.
So 85.
But I've had a million since.
Right. But my point is, you still needed a job in 85.
Yeah.
You had invested a lot of options in 1985 at that point.
Yes, yes.
So you have to be willing to say, I may get fired, but I will do the right thing.
You know, yes. And leaders, I was talking to a group of young people at Catholic University yesterday, and this young person asked this very plaintive question related to this. They said, well, what do you do if you're in a culture that doesn't, or in a situation that doesn't match your values? Do you persevere or do you quit? And I said, well, there is an option in between. And the option in between, before you persevere or quit, is confront. Is to confront. To I've had so many conversations with people. Never underestimate the power of an honest, caring conversation. I had to tell a guy once, he introduced me as a token bimbo to my new subordinates. And I went in, I shut the door, and I said to him, Bob, you can never do that to me again. You don't have to condemn the person to honestly confront their behavior, but you have to honestly confront behavior. It is why I said, if I dare add this, it is why I said in a tone of calm on a presidential debate stage, I think every woman in America heard what Mr. Trump said.
Yeah.
I did not condemn him, but I did confront the behavior.
Yes,
and as
did.
leaders, we have a choice. Sometimes we have to do that.
I love that. I love that, Carly. And just for the record, I decided because you handled that so graciously and so directly, I told my wife, Julie, I said she needs to speak at Spur Leadership because you handled a completely classless situation with such grace and such class, And also knowing a little bit about your story, I assumed that wasn't the first time that you had to respond in that way.
No. Well, not those exact words, but, people make all kinds of judgments based on appearance. We all do that. And
Well, and it's
people
not
make
even-
comments about superficial things to dismiss or demean you. It happens.
But I think that those experiences and those moments are really much more of a Rorschach test for the person making the comment. It says much more about them than it ever would about the person they're saying it about.
Well, my point in bringing that up is to say this. I talked about choice before. We cannot choose our circumstances. Sometimes we cannot choose the people we work with. We can always choose our own behavior. We can always choose our own response. We can always make our own choice about, am I going to live the values or am I just going to talk the talk?
Yeah. So the new book is Finding Your Way.
Find your way.
Find Your Way. I apologize.
Find Your Way.
Find Your Way. And it drops what date?
Monday. But if you will text Carly, C-A-R-L-Y, to 345-345, then we'll tell you how to get it easy.
Very good. Very
And
good.
you can stay in touch with us. We're doing wonderful work in communities all across America. We're doing some wonderful work in communities here in Texas. We have a national network of coaches that we train up and so that they can help lift up leaders wherever they are. On the days when you are, and I know you're trying to give me the hook here, but let me just say,
Not at
because
all.
these are leaders. No, these
You
are
can talk
leaders.
as long as you want.
No, these are leaders. On days when you feel discouraged, and we all do. I mean, it's easy to get up in the morning and watch the media, and it's easy to feel discouraged. On the days when you feel discouraged, let me assure you, because I've been lucky enough to see all kinds of people in all kinds of places all over this nation, let me assure you that there are leaders bursting with potential who are just waiting for the chance to solve the problem that they understand well. And I know many of them are in this room here. The highest calling of a leader is to unlock potential in others. There are leaders everywhere. And I think our job, all of our job, our choice, is to not only be leaders ourselves, but to lift up all those others who can be, if someone will just say, I see possibilities in you.
Carly, we are so grateful. So grateful